So originally we had put a poll up to ask whether we should review Aquaman or Star Wars Episode 9, and the poll actually tied. So the rule in baseball is the tie goes to the runner, and in this case, the tie will go to the regularly formatted show. So are you ready to come on board the last Pantheon episode of 2019? Let's examine one of the biggest movies of last year's holiday season, Aquaman.
Hey, buddy, you that fish boy from the TV? It's Fish Man.
My son, you could unite our worlds one day. The land and the sea.
I'm not a king.
The world needs something more. A hero.
Aquaman. Rated PG-13.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at the real world are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so in 2 ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at Hero Pantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, last week we put Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse into our Superhero Pantheon. This is our final episode of 2019, Brian, and I don't think it took a while for me to process just how much money Aquaman made. And even at the time we reviewed it, I think we both enjoyed the movie, and my feelings are still very similar to when we discussed this movie last year. But I think this movie proves that if you can strike the right tone at the holiday season, you are going to make $1 billion at this point.
Yeah, and it's a safe tone, and it didn't really take much risks or anything like that, but the only risk it took were in the visuals, because it took a long time for the visual effects to put together.
You're telling me that an octopus playing a drum isn't risky? That is the riskiest thing I've ever seen on screen, sir.
Okay, maybe that, but I mean, the effects took a long time. This is why the movie took a long time to release, and maybe in the long run it was a good thing, because I remember this movie not necessarily being slated for December way back when, but because of the effects it was going to take, because they're shooting literally underwater and everything that was going on behind the scenes with it. So maybe it was for the best, because it landed in the Christmas date. I think it was December 20th or whatever last year, something like that. And it was just the perfect timing. And this movie has this old school classic adventure type feel that kind of draws in that kind of casual audience, from the grandpas to the mom and dad. So it's like that movie you go see with the family during Christmas. So I think it just fit the right time, you know what I mean? And they played it safe, but that's totally cool. You could do that as long as you have, like, good directing, great visuals to support it, and the performances for the leads to kind of tie you in, emotionally. So this movie had all that, and it wasn't like so mind blowing or so, challenging or anything like that. But it was still a fun movie that a general audience can appeal to, and I think that's why it drew so much money at the right time on the holidays.
So I think when we talk about Aquaman, we automatically have to discuss Jason Momoa, because I think that, like so many other actors, I think he kind of is emblematic of the character, and he becomes a part of the character. I think we've seen this in numerous other examples: Chadwick Boseman in Black Panther, Chris Evans in Captain America. I think Jason Momoa has really kind of embraced this role, and this is a character who was blonde-haired, Caucasian, resembles Patrick Wilson, who was one of the co-stars in a lot of ways. And I give Zack Snyder a lot of grief on this podcast, and I think most of it is justified. But in this specific case, I give him a lot of credit, because he broke this barrier and he cast Jason Momoa as Aquaman. And part of what makes this so special is that Jason Momoa, he is proud of this because he is Polynesian. Polynesians have a strong aquatic heritage. So I think for those reasons, it makes a lot of sense. And both he and Tamia Morrison, who plays Tom Curry, his father, they're identifying this as being Polynesian. And I think this works out tremendously well. And if we are going to have a conversation about Aquaman, it has to start with Jason Momoa.
Absolutely. And, growing up, my only thing that I knew about Aquaman was the Justice League cartoons, not even just the 2001 one, but the Super Friends, right? That would be reruns on Cartoon Network. And, even Family Guy made the joke. He's kind of a nerd and he just talks to fish and what can he really do and blah, blah, blah. So kind of redefining the character for the modern era, I thought it was a smart move. Jason Momoa is that dude. Like, I remember, like, in 2011, 2012, when I was working at Whole Foods, that, I work near where he lives, and I used to bag groceries for him and his family, him and his boys. I used to see Lisa Bonet all the time. I carried out her groceries one time, and I was marking out because I had a big crush on her from when I watched reruns of The Cosby Show. So that was pretty cool. But the weird thing is like, I always compared him to Entourage, Adrian Grenier or whatever his name is, from the main guy from Entourage. It's so weird because in Entourage they make fun of like this fake movie, the Aquaman, that the character starred in, right? And he ended up becoming Aquaman anyway. So it's almost as if I just kind of predicted he would become Aquaman without even knowing it, because at the time, like, it was just Game of Thrones. And when I noticed it was Jason Momoa and I was like bagging his groceries with all his boys and stuff, I was like, hey, Game of Thrones. He's like, oh, you're a fan of the show, huh? He's like, wait till next week. And the next week he died. But that was just kind of the funny thing. But I always remember him, and just the way that the idea of him becoming Aquaman, I was like, I couldn't believe it at first, but then I thought about it and I was like, God, this is kind of like a cool redefining of the character. A lot of people, I think, will, especially looking up his heritage, it just made sense. You know what I mean? So, and seeing a person of color and, and then the idea of him being multiracial in the movie, I thought was very powerful, considering, I'm a multiracial person myself. So I kind of saw myself a little bit in some of those, like, the family type situations in the drama in the movie. So I kind of related to that. So it really made sense for a modern era.
And if we are going to then talk about Aquaman in terms of kind of the direction that this movie has taken, there is a noticeable shift from the Zack Snyder version of the DCEU as compared to this movie. I think you saw kind of a transition in Wonder Woman. In this case, we are seeing the complete transition away from watered down colors, a lot of blacks, a lot of grays, a lot of slow motion. This is one of the most colorful superhero movies that has ever been created. This goes for Jason Momoa's outfits, to Amber Heard's hair, to what we see underwater. And a lot of the credit has to be given to director James Wan. James Wan is someone who is primarily known for horror movies, and I think you even see some of that throughout Aquaman. But I think I give James Wan a ton of credit for what he was able to do here. He talked about some of the uniqueness of Aquaman, and he talked about kind of how he saw superhero movies. And he said, we're used to superhero movies where the threat is from another dimension or aliens from another universe coming here and trying to destroy our Earth. But we haven't seen one where the main threat is from a massive, massive civilization that is right under our nose in the ocean. The idea that there could be a massive civilization living right underneath us that we don't know about is kind of scary and exciting. So I think you kind of see just how different his perception is. And I think that in addition to that, I think that he kind of simplified, because one of the reasons that I was so trepidatious about this movie is the underwater scene in Justice League was really bad. And that is because they were using protective speech bubbles. And James Wan just eliminated those and said, people are overthinking it. They're just going to talk. And I am so grateful for that, because I don't know if you remember the scene that he and Amber Heard have underwater, but it's really bad. And there isn't a scene as close to being as bad in this movie. Everything just feels so much more smooth and natural.
Totally. And that was kind of one of my worries too, because I was thinking, like, is the whole movie going to be like this when they make Aquaman? Is like, is this going to be a giant bubble here and there for them talking? But that would have been way too distracting. So it's good he was smart enough to figure that out, wipe that out completely. James Wan, I'm not even a fan of him as like his other works and stuff. I've never even seen Saw. Like I've randomly seen Saw 3 with my friends one night because they just dragged me to it years ago. I think it was like 2006, but I'm not really truly a fan of his work. But I mean, I've seen his one of his obscure movies. I think it's called Death Sentence, which is kind of this knockoff of Death Wish, but it had Kevin Bacon in it, and it had some really great cinematography. So I was like, okay, he's good at the indie stuff. I know he's a great, horror director. I think there was another. Oh, I did see The Conjuring, so that was entertaining enough. So I had my trepidations as well, but then when I saw the trailer, I was like, okay, this dude gets it. Like he's bringing the colors back. Even in the trailer, I think the music had the hints of what was to come, and like I loved the soundtrack of what the decisions he made to make it kind of this futuristic soundtrack whenever you went under into the water and stuff like that. So he made some great decisions. He knows what he was doing. I hope that he can do more with the DC, like, because I don't want him to be just limited to this. I know he's got his hand in the new what is it, the Trench movie coming up, which is kind of a spin-off of this, but it's gonna be more of the horror movie element that was in the movie on the boat scene. So he's getting a lot of credit. He deserves it. I kind of want him to do a Justice League movie now because I think he's got these color palettes down so well that I want to see those color palettes applied to the other big DC characters, but maybe have him as a consultant or something like that. But he might have a shot at doing it well.
I think there's a lot of directions that James Wan can go in. I think the world is his oyster at this point. Pun very much intended there. But it's funny to think that he had a choice between directing The Flash and Aquaman. He chose Aquaman. He actually bet on the right horse in that case because we don't know when there's going to be a Flash movie. Of course, there is the CW Arrowverse show, The Flash, but who knows when we are actually going to see this materialize. So he made the right choice. And as you mentioned, there's going to be a spin-off horror movie, something that is very unique in terms of superhero storytelling. I don't think we have not seen a pure horror movie in this genre. And I think there's certainly times when it has been alluded to. I think that you could argue that there are some movies that kind of head in that direction, but it is something that I think is worth exploring. And James Wan, even as a producer, because I think that's something that you have to consider. It's not just that he is a really good director, but like so many other directors, enhancing, bringing up other talents, bringing up other directors. I think that's a really positive thing as well.
Absolutely. And, with the Trench, it's going to be interesting because that scene was very CGI heavy. But if they kind of rely on like a strict budget and kind of restrict that and kind of rely on the old school, like, kind of let the audience kind of, assume what's going on in terms of the visuals in their head kind of thing, kind of maybe like a psychological horror, they can really do well. I mean, Joker was the example of that. They did that for 50 million or 60 million, whatever. Maybe if they give them 70, you know what I mean? Like they can maybe pull it off and maybe make like 150 domestic, something like that. I think that'd be an attainable goal, you know what I mean? If they can even do it on a lesser budget, more power to them, because I think even less of a budget, I think we've talked about this before, they can execute even better, maybe perhaps kind of push them to their limits. But we'll see, because we know, as you mentioned, he's a very successful producer. He doesn't necessarily direct all the direct sequels to the Conjuring franchise, or all the spinoffs or whatever, but he knows what he's doing producer-wise, so maybe that was his idea. Maybe it was his idea to do a Trench movie and kind of like make it a low budget and kind of make a profit for DC.
The Conjuring movies are certainly not my cup of tea, but they are extremely profitable, and that is not something that should be underestimated. And the fact that he is such a great cultivator of talent, I think really speaks well for what he can potentially do. I think the other big person that we have to talk about was Nicole Kidman. She was James Wan's top choice for the role of Atlanta. They were previously set to work together on a remake of At the End of the Spectra, when the film was scrapped. Kidman has long been a supporter of Wan's career and has publicly raved about his films Insidious and The Conjuring, calling him the new master of horror. She was also eager to join him as filming took place in her home country of Australia. This, of course, is Nicole Kidman's second time in the DC universe, as she was, of course, Dr. Chase Meridian under a blanket naked in Batman Forever, very prominently. And despite the fact that she is not one of the top 3 or 4 listed stars of this movie, she gets a lot more to do here than she did in Batman Forever.
Yeah, it's crazy. She made this role like I mean, it could have been generic, it could have been whatever, but she kind of made it what it is. And I think she added credibility to the cast. And when I heard that she was like in the movie, I was like, wow, what a choice. And like at first I thought they were gonna go with like, I don't know, not like a Rene Russo and Thor, you know what I mean? Not as big of a name. But they went big, you know what I mean? Especially now, like looking back, I mean, she's probably gonna get another Oscar nomination this year for Bombshell. So she's really on top of her game, and even for a role like this, you can tell she was having fun, but gave it that kind of heavy drama that it needed, especially at the beginning, I thought. And then it tied, I'm one of those, romantics, I guess, that loves the whole distant lovers story, and then at the end of the movie they come together. You know, my love for Ant-Man 2 in that scene at the end, but I thought they just pulled it off really well, and they did the romance really well at the beginning. And then I just felt like it was her kind of making it kind of legit. You know what I mean? It wasn't cheesy, it wasn't corny, but her presence and her performance made it credible and legit.
With the release of Aquaman, the DC Expanded Universe, which has been much maligned and has gotten a lot of crap, at this point, it had made $4 billion at the box office, which is a boatload of money. If you consider the fact that Joker has made $1 billion, Wonder Woman is going to come very close to that. And I think Birds of Prey is going to make at least $500 million. Even if the Joker is not in that movie, I think people are going to trick themselves into thinking Joker is going to be in that movie. I think Birds of Prey is almost guaranteed to make at least $500 million. So the DC universe, which again, is saying a lot of crap, it's pretty successful as of this point. And this movie specifically made $1 billion at the worldwide box office. This is the first DC Comics movie to cross $1 billion. Not Wonder Woman, not Man of Steel, not Batman vs. Superman. This is the first movie since The Dark Knight Rises to make $1 billion at the worldwide box office for DC.
I'll admit I was shocked, but then you look at the like what I just said earlier in the podcast, like it's the right time of the year. Families, it appeals to a general audience, something that your grandpa or your grandma can kind of go, oh man, this reminds me of those movies from like the 50s and 60s or those old adventure movies, you know what I mean? So it really has a really familiar appeal, but at the same time it's like a little nostalgic, it does have its weird awkward moments. We'll talk about that in the tech stuff with the soundtrack, but I mean it just fucking clicks, you know what I mean? Like it's rare that I think it's lightning in a bottle that it happened here. And if you have a good enough director with it, the script's not even that great. You know what I mean? It's an okay script, but it just clicks.
The script is easily the worst part of this movie, and we'll get into that when we talk about the story. But let's start by talking about the heroes. And I said this before, but Jason Momoa was a total bro in Justice League, and it was really annoying, and I actively disliked his performance. The only scene that I thought really worked was the scene where he was in the Lasso of Truth. And I think in that moment, I think you saw the potential of Aquaman. And in this movie, he dials down the broiness like 10%, and it makes all of the difference in the world. There's still times when he acts like a jackass, but people call him out on it. And I think on the rewatch, I think I appreciated Amber Heard's performance a little bit more. I still don't think the chemistry is all the way there, but I do appreciate that he is constantly being called out for being a jackass when it is appropriate. I think he is overall very endearing, and I think you get to see a lot of character growth from Aquaman. Even though he has kind of been established already, I think you still see him become a little bit more of a hero than what he was even in Justice League, because I think he makes some choices at the beginning that he does not necessarily, that he regrets in the end, and it's really great to see what he individually in this movie is, because Jason Momoa, this could have gone terribly wrong. And the fact that it didn't, I think, is a testament to James Wan as a director, I think some of the script, and I think Jason Momoa himself.
Absolutely, and you're right with the scene with the lasso. I felt like they used that as the inspiration of, okay, let's take that Aquaman that was like the favorite, part of everyone, like that was the favorite Aquaman scene for everyone from Justice League. Let's take that and use that as like the formula for the movie, and they got it right, because you're right. It's he's not as annoying. I love the arc, man, because like it's just like he rejects it, and I know it's cliche, it's a trope, and that's kind of one of the criticisms we'll have in the writing section, but I mean, it's very Lion King, you know what I mean? Like he rejects the throne. Oh, well, he, kind of Lion King. He rejects the throne, you know what I mean? He doesn't want to be the king, and then it's just destiny, and then it becomes destiny towards the end, where he's the chosen one to get Poseidon's trident at the end, and blah blah blah. But I just enjoyed his arc a lot, and the journey, like discovering his mother, discovering his brother, realizing he had this family that he didn't really know about, and then discovering the other side of his heritage that he didn't really know about, only through Willem Dafoe. So I thought it was really great. Amber Heard, on the other hand, I criticized her performance last year. It's still kind of mad to me now, and I guess I'm a little harsh on it last year, but I don't know. I just feel like they could have done a lot better in the casting. I don't know what was going on there, but I think that performance could have been a lot better if they had someone else. But that's one of those things in hindsight. But I mean, hopefully she'll be better in the sequel, because I mean they're definitely gonna have a sequel. But I just enjoyed the arc that they had with Aquaman, and I guess they played it safe with I can't even think of his character name, but Willem Dafoe was like the elder or the teacher character, the mentor character in every movie. I
Volko is the name.
Yeah, I thought they would do more with him, but they just kind of played it safe with him. So that's kind of it is what it is, because he's capable of so much more in every performance he gives. But here it was just so bland, and I was kind of shocked that Willem Dafoe kind of gave a bland performance. But he's gone on record saying that he wasn't really comfortable with all the CGI and the digital effects going on, so it kind of hindered his performance. But he got paid, so
he certainly did. And I don't know about you, but I was expecting a heel turn because it's Willem Dafoe, and we never got it.
I really wasn't expecting. It didn't fit his character. It seemed like he was too genuine. So that's kind of my take on it.
Kind of a weird casting choice, I guess. I don't have anything against Amber Heard's performance per se. In my view, I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem more so continues to be that she does not have a lot of chemistry with Jason Momoa. I think that's kind of where the issue is. And I think the reason that it is so noticeable is because Mira really is not a character outside of Aquaman, and I think that is the inherent problem here. If she had more chemistry with Jason Momoa, I don't think that it would be as much of a problem. And especially because they are supposed to be kind of romantic with each other, I think that's the other thing that unfortunately hurts this role and this movie ultimately. And so I'm a really big fan of Jason Momoa. I think the other heroes, including Willem Dafoe, including Amber Heard, they kind of fall short. I do appreciate Nicole Kidman. I think she's good. I like that she gets a bit to do at the beginning of the movie and at the end. I think Tamara Morrison as Tom, I think he's kind of fine. There really isn't a lot to that character, but I think he does a good job. And how about Dolph Lundgren? What a year he had, especially those final couple months in both Creed 2 and in this movie. Here he plays King Nuriesa. And he kind of steals the show, and he actually gets to act, which is very different than what happens in Rocky IV and even the Expendable movies, where he doesn't really get to act.
I know. I was in shock when I saw this, because we just saw Creed 2 the month before last year, and I'm a big mark for the two Creed movies, and I thought his performance in Creed 2 was just so subtle, nuanced, and like just fucking great. And it was just like this reflection of the character from 30 years ago. And when I see him here, I was like, wow, holy shit, he's back, and he's got red hair. So I was like, okay, let's see where this goes. And he kind of gave this Game of Thrones-esque performance, and I was very impressed with it, and I appreciated it a lot. And you can tell, like, I think it's his age, man. I think something about like these action movie stars that kind of go through the motions when they're younger and do these action movies, and then as they get older, they just learn how to act and get better. And I think Lundgren's one of them. I think Sylvester Stallone is better as an older, like in his like now as an actor. I think just because like again like even Arnold Schwarzenegger. I don't know what it is. It's just I guess age.
Arnold is very good in Terminator Dark Fate. I know you refuse to see the movie, but he is very good in it.
Yeah, I know. I bet he is. It's just I think it's just people learn over time, and you can tell. And he just had those two roles at the end of 2018 that just hit the right marks for me. So I was very impressed, and that made me the only scenes that I like of Amber Heard, because it was like, okay, you're talking to your dad, and then I was kind of in shock that I was listening to Dolph Lundgren talk with some kind of fake Atlantean accent, but it worked, man. He had red hair underwater, so it was unbelievable.
I settled on a score of 7, and I think the only reason I hesitate to give this an 8 or a 9 is because other than Jason Momoa, I think everyone else is either maybe a slight positive or more neutral than anything else. And you could argue the chemistry of this movie is a bit hurt. So that is why I settled on a score of 7.
I'll go with a 7 as well, even though I thought Nicole Kidman did an awesome job too as well. Tom as the dad, he probably could have done more, but I do like the idea of, it's always this idea that, you want to be this warrior like your father. Like, it's always the males that want to be like their father, right? But in this case, it's actually like, I want to be like my mother, because the mother is actually the warrior of the family. So I saw this reflection of like I just saw, whenever I saw Atlanta at the beginning fighting, I just imagined like, oh man, that's totally what like Aquaman's personality and fighting kind of thing he would do. So I thought there was like great connection between the mother and the son this time, of being the warrior that the son wants to be just like the parent. So I thought that was a good little spin on the trope. So I'll go to 7 as well, just because I find some of the other performances kind of underperformed and weak. And I feel bad for Willem Dafoe, because he could have done so much more, but he kind of felt limited. And it is what it is, but he's just got to adapt, I think.
In talking about the villains, I think we have to start with Patrick Wilson, who plays King Orm. And I don't know, on rewatch, I wrote this down, Brian, and I want your opinion specifically on this. It kind of felt like he was doing a Ric Flair impression throughout a lot of the movie. He has turned up the volume, so to speak. He's acting big. And I think there are some movies this performance I think would fall flat, and I would say bad. But I think in this case, I think it totally works. I think given the nature, this is a movie, again, where there's an octopus playing drums. Patrick Wilson turning it up a notch, going full Ric Flair. That's what this movie needed and deserved. I think he captured the tone of this movie really well. And Patrick Wilson is someone that James Wan has used pretty frequently. So I think he and James Wan are very much on the same wavelength. And even though King Orm does not have a lot of pathos, again, this is kind of your generic king character. I think he does a very good job, and good for him. Patrick Wilson is very good. What do you think, Ric Flair?
See, I was thinking 95 Triple H, which is almost a variation of Ric Flair, but it's the same kind of level. So we're kind of on the same page anyway. But I get you. Like, I just wanted him to be more conflicted of whether or not he should be doing this war. I thought there should be more like internal struggle for him. But that's just kind of the way I kind of perceived this character. And I was kind of struggling with the idea if he should be more of like this evil son of a bitch that, you just want to hate by the end of the movie. But there's also this conflict with Aquaman, that he loves his brother because he always wanted to have a brother. And all of a sudden, the first time he meets him, he's in this fight to the death with him. And it's kind of heartbreaking for him, even though he doesn't want to admit it. So I thought there was this nice conflict there. But I just felt like there should have been more of this internal struggle. And I don't mean like a Kylo Ren type of struggle, you know what I mean? It's just like, you discovered this family you didn't have. Do I really need to go through this war? Are the people on the land really those, that evil? I mean, he really went out of his way to kind of, pretty much Vietnam it. And I'm going to say it, like, he kind of orchestrated the war that, which was prevented, but he orchestrated the events to kind of want to go into war with the land people, we'll call them, us people. But, I thought like it should have been a little more, but he kind of played it sort of safe, but at the same time, it was the right tone. That was totally the right tone for the movie. The way that he had his hair, the way he carried himself, especially, and the way that there was that scene where he kind of was an evil son of a bitch, where he killed that other king that was played by Diamond Hansu. Again, another DC character in this DC universe, which is kind of awesome. But he did it right in front of his kid and wife, so. It felt like there was this thing of like, if you're going to go full evil, just go full with it. But then they kind of took it back, because by the end of the movie, you felt bad for the guy. And it's like, he killed all these innocent people, but do we really want to see him be happy at the end? And then they just take him away. So it's still an open kind of conflict that they kind of probably play with in the sequel, which they should, because they should always have this kind of Thor Loki kind of relationship, I think.
And it's funny you mentioned Thor and Loki. I actually think that's something that they were trying to stay away from. And I think it's something they should stay away from, because you are never going to capture the chemistry that Tom Hiddleston and Chris Hemsworth have. So I think it's so important to differentiate these two characters as much as you can. And I think it's in the case of King Orm, I think they really did a good job of that, making him less of a trickster and much more of a war general. I think that is such an important distinction that needs to be made. And I'm curious to know how they are going to keep Aquaman and Thor very distinctive, because I think in the comic books, I think it is fairly distinctive, their characters, because of him being more of a nerd. But in this case, Jason Momoa and Chris Hemsworth, they're kind of similar. So I think it'll be That'll be so important. And you mentioned Vietnam, and Vietnam would be so much more different if Dr. Manhattan was just able to come in and end the war as he did in the Watchmen comic books. In completely unrelated discussion, Yahya Abdul-Mateen as Manta is good, and I'm really excited for him to be even better in the next movie, because here he plays Manta in kind of a supporting role. We do get some of the pathos with his character at the beginning with his father, and Aquaman basically leaving his father for him to die. And we do get some motivation from Manta, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, he was definitely motivated. But the problem was I felt like his dad kind of like he kind of killed himself, it felt like. Because, dude, you didn't have to shoot that bomb at the end and then it caused that thing to fall on you. You could have just, like, let it be. But whatever, it's a movie, I get it. But I do like that sort of origin story they gave him. The only problem is I felt at no point that Black Manta had any shot at beating Aquaman. Even with all the weapons and stuff, I was like, okay.
I think that was the whole point, though, and I think they're going to address that for the sequel.
See, that kind of hurt it for me because I wanted him to be this badass, but I was just like, dude, this guy has like no shot. And then when it did look like he had that shot when he shot him in Italy or whatever, and then he shot him into that wall, I was like, okay. But then Aquaman just kind of came back and then had this big face comeback. So, you know, we're wrestling fans here. I'm gonna do the wrestling comparison. This was very much like, I want to say like Hulk Hogan versus Nikolai Volkov. You know what I mean? I know that's kind of an obscure reference, but Nikolai Volkov just had no shot against Hogan, and the way they tried to portray it, like as if he did have a shot, had no shot at all, man. So that's my criticism here, and I felt like he could have done more. But yeah, I didn't even realize I did that kind of pseudo Watchmen segue. But hey, man, that's why I'm here.
I had a hard time with the villain score because really, other than King Orm and Manta, there really aren't a lot of villains, and I certainly think there is a possibility for us to get more with Randall Park next time. Funny enough, probably will be a huge part of both the MCU and the DCEU moving forward in supporting roles. But I came up with a 6, and I think a lot of that is because King Orm I think Patrick Wilson is good. I don't think the character is as well developed as he could have been. I think Manta is much more well developed, but is not yet the threat that I think he's going to be in the sequel. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing what Abdul-Mateen does, especially because I think people are going to be really excited to see what he does next after his turn in Watchmen. So I'm giving this a 6, but I'm very much looking forward to seeing what happens in the sequel with these two characters.
Me too. So I'm gonna go with a 6. It's just like I just felt like he should have been more of that threat, man. But I guess I see what you're saying. They were going for something kind of different, and he better be this fucking like badass, because I feel like, especially now, and you mentioned the Watchmen performance, he's got this momentum behind him, and I think in the next couple of years he'll get better as an actor even more. So I think it'll be the right time, and just get more, more scenery to chew, so to speak. And I think we'll have some good scenes in the sequel.
All right, let's get to the story, which I think is the weakest aspect of this movie, because as you mentioned, it is kind of cliched and there are a lot of tropes in here. What I always say, though, is my philosophy is there is nothing inherently wrong with telling the same story over and over again. There isn't even necessarily something wrong with having fan service. It is all about the execution. And I think there are a lot of aspects to this movie that are executed so well that I think it makes up for the story not being the best. However, I still think it's pretty weak. Aquaman becomes a king despite his own reluctance. It's a story we've seen a bajillion times in fantasy and sci-fi all across the world. A story that has been done a million times. But the performances are bombastic. The visuals are incredible. And I think this is one of the most visually dazzling superhero movies that we've ever seen. I think even more so than Guardians of the Galaxy. And I know that might be a hot take for you, Brian, but I think in a lot of ways, I think that this movie has some incredible use of color and visuals. I think we start with kind of the romantic angle. I think this seems to borrow elements from Thor and Black Panther in some ways. Aquaman seemingly wants to whip somebody's ass at all time, but he has to learn to be less broy in both the movie and as an actor in this. So I think where the story ends up with him kind of being a king and having to grow up, essentially, I think is something that we've sort of seen in Thor. I think it's done well to the extent that I don't think it overtly hurts the movie. but I don't feel comfortable giving this anything more than a 6.
Yeah, and that's kind of my take on it as well. And like I mentioned, playing it safe or whatever. But everything else was great about it, and just the whole idea of we got to go to the desert, and it's like this convoluted backstory with like the history of Atlantis, and they don't really explain how they all of a sudden could breathe underwater when all of a sudden the city just collapses underwater. Because that's always been my thing with Atlantis. Like, if there was this city underwater, what the hell kind of like physics or biology was going on that made them all of a sudden breathe underwater? They have gills or something? They never really explain that, and that's the whole idea of overthinking it. And it's kind of what Rick and Morty talked about weeks ago with that episode with the talking cat, and I get it. Just don't overthink it. So I think if you take that approach to it, you can have some fun with it. So they did have fun with it, but then they kind of, there's always going to be that criticism of the story and the writing. But if you can put all that aside, you can still have a fun movie, and this was definitely that. So credit to, the direction and the set design and the costume design and all that stuff, and the visual effects people. The writers not so much, but at the same time, that's kind of what they were going for. And sometimes when you play it safe, it's just all about all the other elements of putting the movie together. I'm for that, you know what I mean? And I know that it made me think of Sahara. I know that's random, but that movie Sahara with I think it was Penelope Cruz and Matthew McConaughey, and it had that similar vibe in the desert. And now it's just like, yeah, I get that, and we got to go to the desert, and they're jumping out of the plane like Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom, and she's jumping out without a parachute, and making jokes to the pilot and all that stuff, and being in a plane with carts full of animals and crates full of animals and stuff like that. We've seen it before, but it's that idea of familiarity and nostalgia a little bit, and it's like, oh, okay, they're kind of doing that Indiana Jones thing, and then they start playing Toto, or the remix of Toto Africa. So that might be the only time we talk about Toto Africa on this podcast ever. But stuff like that, it's kind of like, it kind of seems cheesy, but at the same time, when they're actually doing the scenes and they go inside and do the hoopla with the water, and she sucks the water out of his head or whatever, and he's like, I could have just peed on it. It's funny, and then Jason Momoa with his performance kind of carries the load and kind of makes it legit at times, and it works, you know what I mean? So I love that old school kind of classic feel of old school adventure movies. Every now and then I'll go back and watch, like I just watched like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea like a month ago when Disney Plus launched. So I love movies like that, so I love that throwback feel. But it is kind of weak because it's just repeated tropes over and over, and predictability and whatnot, and we know that at the end of the movie Nicole Kidman's going to come back to the dock where Tom's standing and give him a big kiss, and they're going to reunite and blah blah blah, and it's cliche or whatever, but sometimes it's cool. But I'll go with a 6.
I think we are about to get to these two strongest aspects of this movie. From a technical standpoint, I think this movie is visually stunning. The de-aging, I think, is okay, but I'll be honest, in rewatching this on HBO, and maybe some of it has to do with the stream or kind of how they do things, I don't think it held up nearly as well as it did as opposed to the theater. So I kind of have to dock the movie a little bit for that. I think the movie is well-paced. I think there's truly some audacious sights and sounds, but I do think 2 hours and 24 minutes is really pushing it for a movie like this. And what do I know? It made $1 billion, but I still think this is the kind of movie that you really do need to keep under 2 hours. I like the costume design. I love that they had the guts to put Aquaman in his real costume at the end. And I think the score is also very good. So even though I think this is probably visually one of the best movies of the superhero genre, I'm not willing to give this a 10 because of some of the de-aging stuff, and I think the movie being a little bit too long on the editing side. But this, to me, is still Pantheon level. I give this an 8.
I'm going to go with a 9 because at one point towards the end where they were in that final battle, it was just nuts. You know what I mean? It's like you don't even know what's going on. You kind of forget why they're fighting anyway, but you just see people riding sharks, people riding giant, ancient, like, I guess I want to say like sea creatures that have been extinct, or we think they're extinct, that they're just riding it because they're just normal. And it's just crazy shit going on. And I think, who was it? Julie Andrews was the voice of the creature at the bottom. And
yes, because there was a joke made that Julie Andrews was in Aquaman, but it was not in the Mary Poppins sequel.
Yeah, that's crazy to me, because I didn't even notice, but they kind of they really edited her voice to make it seem like not her, but just crazy shit like that. I like that was kind of ambitious, that the way they did that, you know what I mean, and the way it looked and the approach to it, and I love the look of the trench stuff, even though it was maybe a little too CGI, but still like the effectiveness and the way that they shot it in the dark lighting with the boat, and the way that they did I don't know how that works, but a flare underwater. I don't know how that works in real life, but they just did it, so. And it's one of those things, I guess you just kind of like don't overthink it, but it looked visually stunning when he's going under the water and him and Mara trying to swim away from the creatures, and he's got the flare and the light and the way that the kind of light fades as the creatures are coming closer to the brim of the light, stuff like that. And then I love the soundtrack, especially when they go underwater and they go to Atlantis for the first time, and they kind of have that Atlantis kind of sound where it's kind of like this 80s kind of like techno-ish, not techno, but like 80s synthesizer kind of sound, almost like a sci-fi movie from the 80s. I thought that was a great touch. So I'm going to go with a 9, almost a 10. It's just, I thought it was like maybe a little too CGI in the final battle because there was just so much going on, but it's kind of like, I think it's kind of like Endgame. At the end of Endgame, there's just so much CGI going on. It's not a perfect 10, but it's just kind of like, okay, there's just a lot of CGI going on, and it's crazy, and you're just enjoying it.
Yeah, I think you make some very, very fair points. And I think it's in thinking about the legacy, this made more money than any other DCEU movie at least. So I think that earns it some points. I think this literally took over the 2018 holiday season, and I think unlike some of the Star Wars movies, I think it is almost universally loved, and if not loved, then at least liked by people. I think Jason Momoa has really embraced the role, and his popularity should not be underestimated. The fact that Apple TV gave him basically his own show, I think, means something. I think James Wan is a phenomenal genre director. He made the most visually interesting superhero film not named Into the Spider-Verse. Spider-Verse, I think, is the gold standard. And I think that unfortunately, I think holds this movie back, because I think this movie in any other year would be kind of considered very innovative and audacious. But when you have Spider-Verse, it's just really hard to do that. But I am still giving this an 8 because of all the reasons that I mentioned before. The fact that I think that this took over the zeitgeist in a way that I think no other DCEU movie has done. I think the fact that it is so universally popular. I think Wonder Woman, the first 2/3 of Wonder Woman, I think are so much better than this movie. But I think the fact that Aquaman is much more consistent, I think, is what kind of gives this movie a little bit of an edge as far as why the general public likes it. So a ton of credit, and I'm giving the legacy score an 8.
I'll go with a 7. I feel like a 9 or an 8 is like something for like something so critically and like something acclaimed like that we get like all this award buzz. But this movie never got any award buzz at all, maybe just for the effects. So it's all about the money in this case, and it was such a big, massive box office success, and that's kind of where my legacy score lies. It's one of those movies that I picked up on Black Friday, so it was pretty cool. I got it for like $6, but I think it's just one of those movies that it's going to be looked back like 15, 20 years from now as like a big fun movie, but nothing too like, critically acclaimed or, you know what I mean? Like kind of breaking new ground or anything like that. But a 7 is pretty solid anyway.
My total score is a 35, and I believe yours is the same, correct?
Correct. Just kind of up and down in single point digits here and there for different categories.
So for one of the rare times, both of us have given a movie the same score, a 35, which is a total of 70. And that means that this is not going into the superhero pantheon. And I think the story is ultimately what holds it back, because I think with a slightly better story, and there is potential in the sequel for that, I think this could have very easily gone into the pantheon, because I think the performances, I think, are solid. I think that the visuals are what make this, and would have, if this movie was going to enter the pantheon, it would have been because of the visuals. And unfortunately, I don't think the story is good enough. But this is still very fun. I really enjoyed myself watching this again. And I think this is one of those superhero movies that is going to be on TNT forever, and people are going to really embrace it in a second life as well as a first life.
Yeah, that's usually where you get that kind of like need for that sequel, because that post kind of like streaming on TV kind of 2-year period, you know what I mean? And that kind of happened with Batman Begins. So, and then Dark Knight made so much more money. So there's a lot of potential for this franchise as a whole, and I think it's just going to click with a lot of people from a lot of different generations because of those familiar tropes that it has.
So I had a ridiculously hard time coming up with burning questions. So if these burning questions are not good, I apologize. preferred Nicole Kidman DC performance. Is there any doubt that it's this movie?
Yeah, totally. And I know I think I've seen some random YouTube videos that pop up and kind of defend Batman Forever, and we've had that discussion. So it's definitely this one, and it's kind of like a make do, I guess. I'm pretty sure she knows that. You know what I mean? So it's kind of cool that in a Batman movie and an Aquaman movie, we got Nicole Kidman of all people, and she's probably going to be up for an Oscar this year. So that's kind of cool that they could do that, and then especially now with Joaquin Phoenix giving all this critical acclaim and stuff. It's nice to see comic movies have this like thing now where you can have these incredible performances by incredible actors. And we've known that before, but I feel like now it feels like they're starting to reward that. And so, who knows? You know what I mean? Like, what if Nicole Kidman all of a sudden delivers this amazing performance in the sequel and she gets a Best Supporting Actress nomination? It could be possible. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't think Aquaman is ever going to get nominated for acting. I think there are very specific instances of where these actors can potentially win or get nominated. I still think they're going to have a really hard time because I really think that the people voting, they do tend to skew older, and it's going to be really hard for these superhero movies to find success. But certainly I think that Nicole Kidman's performance is significantly better. If people want to enjoy Batman Forever, that's fine. I have nothing against that. But I mean, come on, Nicole Kidman's performance in that movie. I mean, it's kind of a joke. This movie, why did this movie make so much money? I think it's obvious. Releasing it at Christmas time, very crowd pleasing. Not a family movie, but it is a movie where you could take the entire family to and enjoy and embrace. And when there's nothing to do over Christmas break, this is a great way to fill up 3-4 hours, depending how long it takes you to get to the theater. I assume you're in agreement on this?
Yeah, my kind of comparison to this, I've been thinking about this. It's kind of like Moneyball, but like, okay, in baseball, like Moneyball kind of only works in the regular season. Postseason, you're probably going to lose out because you don't have enough power hitters to get to the NLCS or the ALCS. I know this is kind of an obscure reference, but that's kind of the way I see it because you're playing by the numbers and your strength. And you kind of study the metrics of who's your bigger stars. Jason Momoa kind of appeals to a certain audience. Can he appeal to a general audience? And they kind of test the waters with that. And they put it out at the right time. You look at metrics, sometimes the worst movies can make a lot of money. You know what I mean? And it's all about placement in the year. And we talked about this with the bonus podcast with Dark Phoenix. I feel like if they would have released it in November, it probably, I don't know, made some of that money more of the money back. It's just all about placement and timing. So that's kind of my comparison, Moneyball.
I think that's true to an extent. And I think there's also something to be said for the Game of Thrones cachet. The best thing that has happened to a lot of Game of Thrones actors is that they have been killed off and then been able to do projects but still have that cachet. I think it's almost a thing with prestige television in general is you look at a guy like John Bernthal. I mean, he died in season 2 of The Walking Dead and has been able to essentially formulate a career based around the idea that he was Shane from The Walking Dead for 1.5 seasons. And then he's been the Punisher. He's been in Ford versus Ferrari. He's been in all these different projects. And I think Jason Momoa died in the first season of Game of Thrones and then got to do whatever he wanted. Whereas the people who are stuck, or not stuck, I don't want to say stuck, but the people who did Game of Thrones for 8 seasons, they may not get that. They may not get that love reciprocated.
Yeah, I get that feeling too. But let's see what happens because now this backlash is going on with Game of Thrones. But I think Jason Momoa is way above and beyond that. And he's probably, I would argue, yeah, he is. I wouldn't argue it. He is the most successful coming out of Game of Thrones, I think. Probably next to, I would say, Peter Dinklage, maybe.
I mean, Peter Dinklage has had a lot of success within Game of Thrones. But, I mean, he certainly had smaller roles in, like, Pixels and Avengers Infinity War. But he hasn't really had like a breakout movie performance per se. And I in looking at if you look at the cast list of Game of Thrones, I mean, Emilia Clarke was in that awful Terminator sequel. So I think it's kind of been a mixed bag. Lena Headey, we saw her in Dread, but it'll be interesting to see what projects. Richard Madden is going to be in the Eternals, and he has done Bodyguard. Bodyguard was a massive hit in the UK and on Netflix. So I think he is definitely one of those people that you'll be hearing a lot from.
For sure.
All right, let's get to the next question. Did you expect Willem Dafoe to turn heel at some point in the movie? Because I certainly did. It sounds like you did not.
No, I just felt like, especially at the beginning when he's training him as a kid, it felt too genuine and too heartfelt, and he really cared. You know what I mean? It would have been like an insulting kind of thing, I think, if he turned heel, because it was just like, come on, man. Like, he was so humble and nice, and you're gonna turn him just for like the sake of turning him. You know what I mean? Like, that's kind of one of those turns where I feel like you're just turning him for the sake of turning because you don't know what to do with the guy. Again, wrestling terminology, but it applies to movies and TV a lot as well, because sometimes people just turn bad guy and it feels like that did not feel like authentic. It felt artificial and just forced. So I think that would have been happened if that happened in this movie.
Yeah, if there's one thing that really annoys me, it's when they have characters in these big blockbusters just randomly decide to turn heel or face at random points. Yeah, I don't like that either. I think that's really annoying.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, spoiler alert, Rise of Skywalker, someone may or may have not done that, but I was cool with it because they built it up and it was worth it for the 3-movie arc. So
You cannot see my eyes, but they just rolled back into the back of my head so hard.
I know, and I'm okay with that because I got that and a certain scenes that made me happy in that movie.
All right, let's get back to it. Is 2018 the year of Dolph Lundgren?
I had some really interesting thoughts about this. I want to say yes, but I just feel like 85 was just it, because I forgot that he had a small role in A View to a Kill, and I know that's kind of obscure, but to be in a Bond movie and Rocky 4 in the same year, it's pretty huge. So, and I know that he was a major part of this movie as well, but I don't know. It was kind of like, whoa, Dolph Lundgren. But in 85, it was like, this guy is like the man because he's fucking, he's in Rocky 4 and he was the bad guy and everything. So 85 was a big year for him, I think.
Isn't A View to Kill generally regarded as one of the worst Bond movies ever made?
Yeah, and it's one of my favorites, man. It's just cheesy goodness. It's got I think it's my favorite Bond intro, because I love the Bond intros with the music video style and the things they do. And I love Duran Duran, and they play Duran Duran, and it's just so cheesy. But it's got Christopher Walken being the best, like, cheesy 80s Bond villain ever. And yeah, everything just works in the worst possible way in that movie.
I'm not sure if 2018 was the year of Dolph Lundgren, but let's not make it the year of Green Book. Let's all agree to never, ever speak of that movie ever again. What would you like to see from an Aquaman sequel?
It's going to be interesting, because my criticism was about Black Manta. If they can make Black Manta this badass and create this threat and, do something where the stakes are high, that he does something where it really threatens the foundations of Aquaman and possibly Atlantis as a whole, then I think you got some stakes. That's kind of what I want to see. I want to see him elevated more, especially now, considering that we just loved him in Watchmen. Yeah, I want him to do more now. You know what I mean? And I felt kind of like, I know this was before Watchmen, and I know that it's kind of cool that he's portrayed Dr. Manhattan and Black Manta. That's pretty cool as it is. You know what I mean? So, God, I just want that badass Black Manta that I think this Aquaman deserves, because I feel like Aquaman needs that equal. You know what I mean? It felt like even Orm towards the end, once Aquaman got the trident, it was like, Orm doesn't stand a chance. I want that, equal Batman Joker kind of, arch villain kind of feel to it. You know what I mean? And I know that, I'm not a fan of the comics, but that's kind of what the feeling that I want. And I don't know if that comes off well in the comics at all, but even in the Super Friends shit and all that stuff from the 70s and 80s with Aquaman, even in the 2001 Justice League, Black Manta wasn't even that big of a deal. So even now that you've got an actor that's got that credibility now, let's amp it up. Let's make him an equal.
I think that's really important. I think it's Black Manta. I think that's what the Aquaman sequel is going to be focused on. I have a feeling that Patrick Wilson may play a small role in the second one, but I have a feeling that when they wrap this franchise up, that is probably going to be his movie, and they're going to have their big final battle at the end of the third one. But I really do want to see Black Manta in number 2 as the primary villain, and to, as you said, be built up as the equal. With that in mind, that is the end of our Aquaman conversation, and we have put all the 2018 movies to bed. We will be getting into 2019 as it comes up where appropriate. Brian, we are taking next week off because I'm going to release the final episode of Mars Investigated, episode 5, where we discussed season 4. And that is not an ending at all that has caused any controversy. So it'll be nice to cover a nice, easy topic.
For sure, and you guys are fans of that, so that's. I'll listen to the episodes here and there. It's just I can't relate because I can't find myself to watch that show. It's just too much already. I got enough on my plate as it is. But y'all enjoy. It's a nice little side dish to this main course of this podcast. So there's always going to be a variety. We got variety coming next year because we keep talking about that X-Men podcast, and it's definitely coming because I'm already planning it in my head for how many episodes and whatnot. So we're gonna have some fun.
In 2 weeks, we are going to start our Power Rangers run. As I have reminded Brian, there are 3 theatrical Power Rangers movies. One that came out in 1995, one that came out in 1998, and the other of which came out in 2017. We will be having some fun with that. So when we come back in 2020, we will be covering the 3 Power Rangers movies to start the year off, and then we will continue on. At some point in 2020, we are going to be finished for all intents and purposes. There may be some stragglers, but we are intending on finishing at some point in the first half of 2020. And I can tell you right now that our finale will be Avengers Endgame. That will probably come sometime in May or June.
Oh, how poetic is that? It seems like this culmination of all these different movies coming together at the end for one big finale. Sound familiar?
It does sound familiar, and it'll be fitting to talk about that. So for Brian, my name is Jerome. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. We will talk to you again in 2 weeks.
My man.